Hey guys, I'm Pedram, surgical resident from Melbourne, and in this video series we're going to be discussing tips and tricks to passing the GSSE, which is one of the first hurdles that budding surgeons will need to pass. In this particular video we're going to be discussing the structure of the exam, when to sit the exam, how much time you need to study for the exam. We'll give you an introduction to the study plan, and also we'll talk about some leave entitlements. Now, just before we get started, a little bit about myself. I'm a PGY 3 surgical resident in Melbourne. I have passed my GSSE, did it on my first shot, thankfully. Got some marks I was very happy with. I've also sat my Diploma of Anatomy and passed that, also with marks that I'm very happy with. And I do some teaching for a medical school within Melbourne as well. So hopefully that provides me with enough credentials to have a discussion with you guys about some tips and tricks on how to pass the GSSE. All right, let's get started. The GSSE is structured as a two-part exam that goes across 2 days, with each part being 150 minutes and worth roughly 50% of the marks for your overall GSSE score. The first exam is your anatomy exam and consists of 60 multiple choice questions, which are in a true-false fashion, and 20 spot questions. The second exam, which is your pathology and physiology exam, consists of 125 questions, roughly split down the middle with regards to pathology and physiology. The pathology and physiology exam consists of your standard multiple choice type questions, statement and reason questions, as well as your true-false type multiple choice questions. We'll delve deeper into the types of questions in another video. Now, there are two criteria you need to meet if you are to pass the GSSE. The first is that you need to meet the minimum mark required for each component, that being anatomy, physiology, and pathology. You also need to meet a minimum mark of the overall exam to pass. Now, the overall mark to pass is higher than the individual components required. What that means is that you can't just hit the minimum requirements for each of the three components, which is usually in the high 50%, and still pass the exam. You still need to do relatively well on the exam in order to pass. Now, the fail rate of the exam has been documented as high as around 50% in the past, and given that the exam costs about a bit over $4,500, it's definitely in our best interest to make sure that we've got the tactics down right to give us the best chance of passing. When should you sit the exam? So there's 3 sittings of the GSSE every year, one in Feb, one in June, and one in October, and each have their pros and cons. One of the first things you need to consider when thinking about which sitting you're going to take is the period of time prior to the exam that you're going to be studying and what you would normally be doing during those times. I'll use myself as an example. So I didn't want to sit the February exam because my birthday is in January. I love going to wineries and going to beach houses and to the beach during the summer period. So the February exam would have meant that I would be sacrificing a lot of the things that make me happy as a person. So I chose not to do that and to go for the June exam instead. Lots of people end up sitting the June exam because you've passed your summer period. You generally start studying early in the year, such as around January or February. And then by the time you hit June, you've done your exam and then you've got the rest of the year to relax. It's also good because if for some reason you start studying for the exam and you realize you're either not prepared or something comes up, you can always defer to the October exam and still complete the GSSE within that year. So that's another good reason to do the June exam. If you are doing a diploma course, such as the Diploma of Surgical Anatomy, that actually lines up really well with the June exam. So you end up doing your final examinations for the Diploma of Surgical Anatomy end of May, which sets you up nicely for you to sit your exams in June. The October option is another option that you have. Obviously later on in the year allows you a little bit more time to study throughout the year, but keep in mind that studying for a longer period of time is not always better. So you want to try and avoid burnout, and the longer you try and study for, the higher the chance of you burning out will be, especially if you are keeping up a really high pace. So you don't necessarily just want to do the October exam because you want to have 10 months worth of study under your belt, starting from the start of the year. The other thing to consider when thinking about when you might want to schedule your exam is what rotations you have on for the year. So it would be ideal if the 1 or 2 rotations that you have prior to sitting the GSSE are more lower workload or lower contact hour rotations. So for myself, prior to my GSSE, I had an ICU term, which was shift work, just like most critical care rotations, which meant that outside of work hours, I knew that I would be free and I could sit down and I could study. Depending on the ICU shifts, some shifts were a little bit more cruisy than others, and I was able to study during those shifts as well. However, if you're doing a really heavy surgical term, like for example neurosurgery or trauma, then you may not have that luxury of either time during the shift, or you may have very haphazard shifts that you're doing, or perhaps lots of long shifts that you're doing, which means that your study may be affected. So keep that in mind. Try to have your rotation selection in mind when you're discussing or deciding when you want to do your GSSE exam. I also did a run of nights prior to my GSSE, which was good because it was kind of week on, week off style of nights, which meant that during the week that I was on, I was largely relaxing, so to speak, or maybe only revising a little bit. And then in my weeks off, I would do intensive study. You also need to keep in mind the other commitments that you have in your life. So you may have birthdays, celebrations, or other commitments that you have, and try to factor them in when deciding when you want to sit your GSSE. How much time do you need to study for the exam? So this really depends on you as an individual. I would probably say you need around about 3 to 6 months of study, depending on A, your work schedule, and also B, the type of study that you're used to. I'm not much of a crammer, which is why for my study plan, it was about a 22-week study plan, so just short of 6 months. But some people who are crammers may find that they can get all of the information that they need in a shorter period of time, although that's not necessarily what I would recommend. Now, my 22-week study plan was based on me attempting to study 3 to 6 days a week. I would always be aiming for 6 days a week. However, due to certain commitments, whether they be work or life commitments, sometimes that number would be less. And depending on the day, I would be studying for anywhere between 1 to 8 hours a day. Again, depending on what other commitments I have. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a ballpark figure about how much time you need to commit. It'll also depend on how much leave you have, and we'll talk about leave in just a moment. So this is the study plan that I had, and I'm just showing you the study plan because later on we'll actually delve into it a little bit deeper. But as you can see, it's 22 weeks long. It's bodily systems focused, and we've got 18 active weeks and around about 4 revision weeks. Again, we'll talk more in depth about this later. The alternative to using this kind of study plan is going for more of a topics-based study plan based on the topics presented by the RACS team on their website, and I'll pop those here as well. Finally, let's discuss study leave. So as per the EBA, you are actually allowed up to 8 days of study leave for big exams such as the GSSE. Now, your workplace only needs to give you a minimum of 3 days clear prior to the exam. So given that the exams are on Wednesdays and Thursdays, typically you can get the Tuesday, the Monday, and the Sunday off, but your work may be more generous and might give you more days off beforehand as well. You may also have a little bit of annual leave, which you can play around with. And if you wanted to, you could put that annual leave prior to your exam. So maybe the 1 or 2 weeks prior to the exam or leading up to the exam to allow you to have some more intensive revision study time. Alternatively, you might want to organize your annual leave for just after the exam so you have a bit of cool down time. I didn't use my annual leave beforehand, but that was because I was lucky with my rotations prior to the exam where I had lower work hour rotations, allowing me to do consistent study in the 3 months prior to my exam. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll be discussing the resources that you can use to study for the GSSE. Thanks, guys.